Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to World History. Today we're going to continue our study of Japanese history by introducing the three great unifiers of the late Sengoku, and especially Tokugawa Ieyasu, the guy who created the Tokugawa Shogunate, the government that's going to rule Japan from approximately 1600 all the way through to the mid-1850s. So, here are our objectives for today, and we'll dive into our story. When we last left Japan, they were in the midst of the Warring States period, a period of Japanese history in which great daimyo vied for power with their armies of samurai, and specifically their mobilizations of peasants. In the late Sengoku period, what we started to see was, rather than fighting these sort of ritualized battles, with samurai fighting individual duels with each other to try to establish their bravery and honor, we started to see mass mobilization of peasant populations. The guy who most popularized this new style of Japanese combat, honestly, and we're talking about basically the military revolution here, right? I mean, this is exactly the same thing that happened with the new monarchs in Europe and the Ottoman Empire and and sort of across these different societies, the creation of massive amounts of infantry to replace expensive noble-based cavalry. So Oda Nobunaga brings this to Japan just slightly later than other places. And he's going to use these massive peasant armies to try to start consolidating power. You can see Oda Nobunaga has just this sort of tiny province here at the start of his conquest. And then he's going to take significant territory, especially suppressing a sort of Buddhist militist movement known as the Iko-Ike. The Iko-Ike are a Buddhist society that promoted sort of equality and independence from the daimyo. And obviously, the daimyo found this spectacularly threatening for what I hope are obvious reasons. And so Oda Nobunaga suppressed this Buddhist movement, these Iko-Ike, with incredibly brutal tactics, most famously surrounding and setting fire to the shrine on Mount Hiei, killing all of the people inside. He was known for using absolutely supreme brutality in his conquests, which on the one hand was incredibly effective at taking over territory, but was much more challenging in ruling it, because of course brutal suppressions of populations create substantial resentment amongst those populations, leading to potential unrest and increased resistance. Oda Nobunaga's, this is his seal, his daimyo seal, with the slogan Tenkafubu, or all the world by force of arms, or all of heaven united under one sword. Translating sort of these East Asian ideas into English is often somewhat complicated, but either way, the message is the same. I'm going to use military force to suppress all of Japan and to eventually become shogun. One of the ways in which he did this is trade with foreigners, or as they were known in Japanese, the nanban. By bringing in and encouraging foreign missionaries into Japan, Oda Nobunaga was able to get access to modern weapons, namely firearms, which he could then use to equip his peasant armies. And he created a massive navy using modern cannons. And with this advanced Western technology, Nobunaga is able to start to slowly overcome his rivals and significantly increase the size of his domain. By the late 1500s, Nobunaga has defeated most of his rivals, most famously burning a number of their castles with their entire families inside, and has suppressed all of the Iko-Ike movements and then he starts persecuting in general Buddhists, especially Amida Buddhists, in order to try to suppress this movement for good. He's now taken over a significant amount of territory, along with his lieutenants Hideyoshi and Tokugawa, with only a few of the Japanese warrior clans left, the Chokosabe and Shimazu clans, and again the Mori in the south resisting him. So at this point, Nobunaga probably has enough influence to be able to march on Kyoto and force the emperor to declare him the shogun. But before he can do that, he's betrayed by one of his key generals who'd been alienated by some of his harsh tactics. This general launched an assault against him. A fire was started in Nobunaga's palace, and Nobunaga was either killed in the fighting or leapt to his death in the fire. We're not totally clear. But either way, Nobunaga is dead, and along with it goes his ambitions of unifying all of Japan. Nobunaga's legacy and mantle was taken up by a guy named Hideyoshi Toyotomi. Hideyoshi was a commoner who started out as Nobunaga's sandal bearer, a relatively low-level position, but through his bravery and cunning, his nickname was the Monkey, he ended up rising to be one of Nobunaga's key supporters and warlords. And he famously scaled a very sharp cliff to find his way into an opponent's fortress, open the doors from the inside, allowing it to be taken. This allowed Nobunaga to take the fortress and elevated Hideyoshi to high status within Nobunaga's sort of entourage. He then hunts down and kills the rebellious general who killed Nobunaga, and is able to, because of that, consolidate most of Nobunaga's followers behind him. Hideyoshi then starts consolidating his own power, most famously instituting a sword hunt, removing all swords from the population who are not samurai, basically trying to undo the whole military revolution thing, with the idea that if no one else can use these large numbers of these peasant soldiers, my samurai and my followers are going to be almost unquestioned. And so here's Hideyoshi's famous sword ordinance, basically trying to, again, disarm the peasant population and prevent future uprisings. Hideyoshi was never able to be declared shogun himself. He lacked the noble birth. In fact, he didn't even have a last name or a family name. So he had to invent his whole family name and family line. So he was never going to be able to be declared shogun. But his own exploits made him hope that someday his son could be shogun. And so Hideyoshi, because of this, took on a number of very aggressive military campaigns to attempt to get the status to become noble to pass on to his son. One, he invaded Korea, and they fought a proxy war. Hideyoshi fought a proxy war against the Ming dynasty in Korea. This was during the reign of the Wanli Emperor, as you remember from previous classes, which drained the later Ming dynasty of resources, but it also substantially weakened Hideyoshi's forces. He also declared that Christianity should be outlawed and tried to limit foreign trade in order to sort of consolidate power. Plus, there were some stirrings of peasant uprisings associated with Christianity. And so Hideyoshi is going to order huge numbers of Christians persecuted and Christianity outlawed. And so that's going to cost a significant amount of money to prosecute all of that. And then, after his death, he became very unstable and potentially murderous. As it notes here, Hideyoshi adopted a son and heir because his wife wasn't able to provide one for him. But later in his life, one of his wives gave birth to a healthy son, and so Hideyoshi ordered his adopted son to kill himself. Then, right after this, Hideyoshi died. So this is somewhat problematic because Hideyoshi has now killed his of-age adopted son, or had him kill himself, and now has an infant who's going to rule. So he appointed a council of leading daimyo to rule as a regency until his son came of age, and he required those daimyo to swear eternal loyalty to his son. Unfortunately, during this time period, that was probably not going to be enough to ensure their loyalty. And indeed, Hideyoshi's infant son would never actually rule. Instead, he'd be betrayed by one of the daimyo who had agreed to defend him, Tokugawa Ieyasu, who seized control of most of Hideyoshi's forces. There's Tokugawa sitting there, and led them into battle against the remaining elements opposing him. The decisive battle was Sekigahara, in which Tokugawa's forces were able to defeat the opposing forces because one of the opposing generals switched sides in the middle of the battle, turned on his allies in order to try to get a better deal out of Tokugawa. It was well known that Tokugawa had offered better rewards and status and lands to daimyo who came over to him willingly, and had ordered and was planning to punish the daimyo who resisted his rule. And so this daimyo, hoping to get into one of those other daimyo camps, was able to switch sides and lead to Tokugawa becoming shogun. Tokugawa set up this network of daimyo, where the Shimpan daimyo would be the daimyo who were with Tokugawa from the beginning. Fudai daimyo would be daimyo who came over and sweared loyalty eventually, and then the Tozama daimyo are daimyo who opposed Tokugawa. Tokugawa would then shrink or would enlarge or shrink the size of their estates based on how much support they had for him. And so by this, he would reward and allow his followers to become incredibly rich and powerful, and would economically punish his rivals, ensuring that he would keep control over them. So this Shimpan, Fudai, and Tozama daimyo divide would exist throughout the rest of the Tokugawa period. Tokugawa also created a system of loyalty called Sunken Kotai. The Sunken Kotai, or alternative attendance system, demanded that all daimyos maintain 2 residences. They would have to have a residence in their domain, of course, to rule effectively there, but they would also have to have a residence in Edo, the center of Tokugawa's city and the capital of his bakufu, his government. This helped control the daimyo in 2 different ways. One, it was incredibly expensive to maintain 2 provincial capitals and 2 provincial households, and so this drained the daimyo of money. The daimyo who opposed, the Tozama daimyo who opposed Tokugawa, they generally were furthest away, and so at least part of the time this kept them out of their domains. Tokugawa also demanded that the wives and children of these enemy daimyo, of all daimyo, would reside in Edo, meaning that if any of these Tozama daimyo rose in defiance of Tokugawa, he could have them put to death. And they were forced to have an elaborate procession between their home province and Edo every year, which also cost spectacular amounts of money. Tokugawa would use these daimyo would use these processions to try to show each other up and gain status, but would also drain their financial resources in doing so. So this is one way that Tokugawa, in addition to changing the size of samurai of these daimyo's domains, would control these daimyo. The Sunken Kotai system had a couple different effects, as we said. One, it, of course, was very expensive, and it kept hostages. But secondarily, it also kept the heirs of these families in Edo and out of their family domains, preventing them from developing allies around them and making sure that they, by the time they came of age, they wouldn't be able to move back to a seat of power where they were comfortable. So all of these reasons led Tokugawa to consolidate his own central power. During this time period, Japanese history reached a zenith of cultural influence. Specifically, the puppet theaters, the bunraku of Japanese artists became very popular. We also got Japanese art forms like no and kabuki theaters becoming popular during this time period. These staged performances became incredibly popular entertainment, both for the daimyo and samurai, but also for the lower classes. We got these fabulous palaces created to help to have these daimyo show off, especially in Edo, but also in their home provinces. And Japanese art reached, this was also a high period of Japanese art, specifically the natural themes and the views of Mount Fuji. This is your Great Wave of Kanagawa. So, focusing on sort of natural, traditional themes. Under Tokugawa, we also got a strict stratification of social classes. Previously, people like Hideyoshi could move up in social class through the glory on the battlefield, but under Tokugawa, we got these classes locked in. The emperor is on top, but he doesn't have any real power. The shogun is the real ruler of Japan, and then he controls the daimyo through the Sunken Kotai system. The samurai were below them. They were traditionally warriors, but during Tokugawa, there was about 250 years of peace, and so the samurai instead became mostly bureaucrats and administrators. They became the might and the sort of the heart of Tokugawa's government system. And then the peasants and artisans are below them, and then in traditional Confucian style, the merchants are on the bottom. Bushido became an important concept during this time period, despite the fact that samurai were not actually fighting. This concept of samurai loyalty was incredibly important to the structure of the Tokugawa dynasty, because it's almost a Confucian-style relational hierarchy, where the daimyos have sworn loyalty to Tokugawa, and the samurai have sworn loyalty to the daimyo. And so you saw, despite the fact that they didn't need this warrior code, it became almost like a code of conduct, a social code during this time period. The most famous example of the importance of this is the 49 Ronin story, where a important daimyo was was tricked into bearing his sword in the presence of the shogun in the shogunate palace by one of his rivals, and then was then put to death. And so the question is, do the men who have sworn loyalty to this daimyo who was punished and disgraced, should they commit ritual suicide, seppuku, in order to restore their honor, or should they hold off on doing that until they can kill the guy's rival, the guy who tricked him? In the end, they decide to get vengeance on the rival, and this morality tale sort of highlights some of the honor conflicts within Japanese society, because there were educated debates about whether or not did they do the right thing by not killing themselves immediately and instead avenging their master, or would it have been more honorable to take their own lives as opposed to seeking vengeance? And so that's the story of the 49 Ronin, one of the most important samurai morality tales. In the later years of Tokugawa's reign, you had the Shimbara Christian rebellion on the southern Japanese island of Kyushu, and this led to a significant rebellion leading to a lot of loss of life and destruction of property. Tokugawa came in and suppressed the rebellion brutally, spectacularly killing all Christians who were involved and burning a number of towns and palaces. And in the aftermath of this, Tokugawa signed the Act of Seclusion, banning Japanese people from coming abroad and banning foreigners from coming into Japan. It was never truly as tight as this. Japanese were still allowed to go to China and other East Asian societies, but it did effectively isolate the Japanese to some extent, and the Sakoku closed country policy limited all foreign trade to just the Dutch and just one man-made island on the outside in the port of Nagasaki. Because of this, new ideas and concepts and technology for the most part stayed out of Japan. There was certainly still some trade between Japan and China and Korea and those places, but for the most part, the Japanese refused to allow any other foreigners in and totally closed themselves off to foreign trade, cutting off significant sources of income and also access to modern technology. Christianity as a religion was also banned, and famously, any Christian who arrived in Japan would be crucified on the beach where they showed up. Their ship would then be set aflame and sent out to sea to sink. So the Japanese were pretty serious about this whole no foreigners thing. So that's the Tokugawa Shogunate. We'll return to them in a couple hundred years to see what happens when they come into contact with a much more advanced rest of the world. But for now, we'll leave Japan behind and close our Asia unit. Thank you for listening.